we like to do, we've done this several times. We like to do little history classes on our Wednesday night Bible study sometimes. Last year we went over Thanksgiving, we went over Christmas, and we've done Easter. So I think those are the three holiday histories that we have done. And since today is the day before Halloween, I thought it would be good for us to do a history of Halloween. A Halloween history, if you will, because, you don't have to go far. I'm sure many of us know people who say these things, or maybe we say these things ourselves, or you see them on social media, Facebook or whatever. You see people talking about Halloween and this during this time, and whether or not Christians should participate in Halloween, where Halloween comes from, why it is not appropriate to do the whole Halloween thing. And usually the story goes like this. Come on in. Usually the story goes something like this. It goes, it's inappropriate for Christians to celebrate Halloween because Halloween is rooted in paganism and demonic devil worship and witchcraft and everything else. And so any Christian or any Christian family who does anything even remotely associated to Halloween is worshiping the devil, basically, and you just shouldn't do that. That's kind of how the argument goes. And most of the controversy, even from what I just said, really is centered around the origins of Halloween. Much of the controversy, much of the questioning that we have, much of the accusations that are hurled around have everything to do with what is the origin of this holiday. What is its focus? What are we even really doing? And I think it's important for us, if we're going to rightly think about really anything, but particularly Halloween, if we're going to think about it correctly, we need to kind of know the history. We need to know the context. We need to know the origin. And I believe that's true about anything. Anytime I start to study a new idea, a new topic, one of the first things I do is I read up on the history of said topic. So when I became a Christian, I very quickly fell in love with Christian history. When I want to study something about the Roman Empire, I will read the history of the Roman Empire. If I want to know more about the New Testament and the life of Jesus, I will study the historical context of where Jesus lived and when he ministered, just so I can kind of have an accurate view of what's going on. Well, the same thing is true when we talk about Halloween or any other holiday. If we're going to rightly understand it, we need to know its history. History is incredibly important. So, just kind of getting straight into it here, the first thing I want to talk about is the different influences of Halloween. Halloween has pagan influences. Halloween has Christian influences. Halloween has secular influences. And so you might ask the question, well, is Halloween pagan? Is Halloween Christian? Is Halloween secular? Does Halloween have to do with the demonic and the occult? Does Halloween have to do with praying for the dead and various things? Does Halloween have to do with just little kids getting candy and dressing in costumes? And the answer to all of those questions is yes. It's yes. And the truth is that Halloween has all of these influences. So let's start with the pagan influence. Now, Halloween really, this is how the story goes. This is what you will hear if you watch a video on the internet or if you listen to somebody talk about this. They'll typically say that the ancient Celtic peoples were like the Irish, the Scottish, the British. The Celts were the northern barbarians, the barbarians that existed on the northern border of the Roman Empire, which went all the way halfway up through Britain. Okay, so the Celts, when we talk about the Celts, we're really talking about a very specific people group that lived in and around Britain, Ireland, and Scotland. Those are the Celts. And the Celts had this religious festival that they would celebrate every year, and it was called the Festival of Samhain. And it's spelled, if you were to look at this, Samhain. So it's spelled like Samhain or something, but it's pronounced Samhain. So this festival, Samhain, which was a Celtic festival, it always happened on October the 31st. And the idea behind Samhain was that was the day that the days were getting shorter, the days were getting darker earlier, like we're experiencing. And on that day, the kind of veil, the border between the physical world and the spiritual world was very thin. And the idea was that these spirits, particularly evil spirits, would exit the spiritual world and come into the natural world, the physical world, and they would, harass people, and they would bring bad omens and all of this stuff. And so part of the celebration of Samhain was sometimes people would dress up to try to deceive these dead spirits. They would disfigure themselves or change their appearance in some way to kind of hide from these spirits. There would be, like druid monks who would perform all of these little spells, and they had bonfires, and there was incantations, and all of these different religious pagan aspects that went into this celebration of Samhain. But Samhain wasn't only about animal sacrifice and warding off evil spirits and stuff. Has anyone ever seen the movie Brave, the Disney cartoon Brave? With the red-haired girl. It's about Scottish people who lived back in the day. Well, if you've seen that movie, you might remember the scene where all of the different Scottish tribes get together. And they're all partying, and they're all drinking, and they're all like looking for suitors to marry the main tribe king's daughter, right? All of these things, everyone's carrying on, they're playing games, they're celebrating with one another. This is probably what the celebration of Samhain was like. In reality, Samhain was like a fall festival. Samhain was a time of year where all of these different Celtic tribes would get together, and there was a lot of important political things that were taking place. All the rulers of the tribes, they got together at this point in the year to hold conference, to hold council, to speak to one another, to whatever they're going to do. There was a time where they were making suitors and making these political marriages and connections. It was a time, as we said, where they're warding off evil spirits, and there is a religious aspect of that, where they're making sacrifices and all of that other stuff. But all in all, the celebration of Samhain really appears to have been like a giant, several-day-long fall festival type of thing, where they would harvest and they were all eating and feasting and drinking and carrying on politically, and yes, of course, carrying on with all of their pagan worship of their deities and those things as well. Most of what we know about, or most of what we think about the idea of Samhain being related to the demonic, most of what we think we know about this festival of Samhain being associated with the Lord of Darkness comes from a man by the name of Charles Valency. Charles Valency. He was an English general who was stationed in Ireland in the early 1800s, and he was just like in love with the Irish people. And he's written a lot of works. He wrote a lot of works about Irish grammar and the history of the Irish language. But he also wrote some works concerning the history of the Irish people. And, a lot of historians really don't like his works because they're just not very good according to like modern historical standards. He doesn't really draw on any primary sources because none exist. One thing to know about the Celtic people is they didn't leave behind any writings. So we don't really know a lot about what they did. We don't really know a lot about how they lived. We don't really know a lot about their practices because they never wrote any of it down. Most of what we know about the Celtics comes from the perspective of the Romans, comes from the perspective of medieval European peoples, but there is very little, in fact, no primary source that tells us what the Celts were like, or how they worshipped, or what they did during this party. A lot of it just comes down to things that have been said historically about them. And Charles Valency kind of continued in this vein. So the truth is, we don't know a lot about Samhain. This is the first thing I want us to remember. We know a little bit about it. We know what we think we know about it. But in reality, we don't know too much about it. But the things that I outlined are kind of the basics. Now, what do we get from this? How has the ancient practice of Samhain influenced modern Halloween? Well, first of all, this is where the date comes from. October 31st. October 31st is when they always did this. You do see a focus on the dead. You see a focus on evil spirits. You even see some of the occult influence, and even some of the fall festival influence and the partying influence. All of this, you could say, is really rooted in this pagan practice of Samhain. Again, that's where we get the date. There is this emphasis on the dead, a veil between the living and the dead, evil spirits coming in, all of the occultic stuff. All of that, I think, can be safely kind of drawn back from the pagan influence. But it's not only the pagans that influenced what we're talking about when we talk about Halloween. There was also a Christian influence. There was a Catholic influence. Medieval Catholics celebrated a season that was called All Hallows Tide. Okay? All Hallows Tide. And just to kind of break this down a little bit, around the year 740 AD, All Saints' Day became a holiday on the Roman Catholic calendar of worship. And All Saints' Day is celebrated on November 1st. And All Saints' Day was a day of celebrating the departed saints. Praying to saints, praying for saints, asking saints to pray for you. It's basically a day to remember and to honor the saints that have died and gone to be with the Lord. All Saints' Day. And following All Saints' Day on November 2nd was another holiday called All Souls' Day. This is a Roman Catholic holiday. And All Souls' Day is very similar. Praying for the dead, praying to the dead, praying for those who are in purgatory. It was just a day to remember and to celebrate and to pray for all of those who have died and gone before and were in purgatory, who were already in heaven with the Lord. This is All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day. And October the 31st, which is the day before all of this, became known as All Hallows' Eve. So sometime in the 700s or 800s, All Hallows' Eve really became a major thing. And these 3 days together, All Hallows' Eve, All Saints' Day, All Souls' Day, has become known as All Hallows' Tide. Well, All Hallows' Eve, I'm sure many of you have heard, is, of course, where we get the name Halloween. So there is that Catholic influence, that medieval Catholic influence that has influenced it. And the biggest influence of the medieval Catholics to what we have today is the name. I mean, that's where the name came from. All Hallows' Eve was turned into Halloween. And a lot of people have this idea that medieval Catholics, they would go into a pagan place and they would take all of these pagan festivals and celebrations that they were doing, and the Catholics would just move in and wholesale adopt everything the pagans were doing, and then stamp a cross on it and say, this is Christian now. This is part of the Catholic Church. We're doing this. They call this syncretism. Syncretism. And that's the idea, again, like the Catholic Church goes in, adopts these pagan things, and just slaps a cross on it. And that's kind of true, but it's really not true at the same time. And I'm going to illustrate it using Halloween. There is a fundamental difference between what's happening on All Souls' Day, All Saints' Day, All Hallows' Eve, where people are remembering, honoring, and praying for the dead. That's a very different thing than what was going on amongst the pagan Celts, who were dressing up and hiding from evil demonic spirits who were penetrating the material world. You notice the difference there? It's not the same thing. It's not like the Catholic Church said, we're just going to adopt all of these practices and then stamp a cross on it. It actually is quite a different thing to remember and to honor the dead versus to be afraid of the dead and try to hide from them and do incantations and seances to try to ease the dead in your life or whatever. He's having a hard time over here. Yeah, he's having a hard time. And the point why I'm saying that, though, is so that we can kind of understand. We want to understand that when the Catholic Church would go into these places, it wasn't just a wholesale adoption. They did change these celebrations. They did fundamentally change the religious nature of Samhain. But even though they changed the religious nature, that doesn't mean that they changed the whole culture. They didn't change the whole heritage. So the Catholics go into Ireland, they go into Britain, they go into Scotland, and they basically Christianize the place. But you still have hundreds and thousands of years of this cultural norm that exists of celebrating this celebration at this time of year. We already said it's important politically. It's important in terms of finding suitors and intermarrying within the tribes and just all of the different things. It's like a big harvest festival, right? So all of that culturally still exists, but the religious element of it has been fundamentally transformed into a into a medieval Roman Catholic system of praying for the dead. But the reason why I'm pointing this out is simply to say, once again, that when the Catholics would do this, it wasn't just an adoption of paganism, it was actually changing it. The reason why it oftentimes gets a bad name is because they would keep the cultural importance. They would keep that cultural fire alive, if you will, so that people were still gathering, they were still celebrating, they were still doing all of the things they were accustomed to doing, just now it doesn't have that pagan influence, it has a Christian religious aspect to it. Okay? Any questions about anything we've talked about so far? I know that's a lot of information coming at you. So just to recap, we've got some pagan influences from Samhain and the Celts. And keep in mind what I said about these people. This is a very limited place geographically. So we're not talking about all of Europe. We're talking about like the British Isles is what we're talking about. So this is a very local custom. This is not something that was happening in Germany. This is not something that was happening in Italy. This is not something that was happening in Spain. This is something that was happening on the British Isles. And that's going to become important because it obviously comes into America from the British Isles. And we're going to talk about that in a moment as well. But we've got this pagan influence. We've got this Christian medieval Catholic influence, which is where we get the name. All Hallows Eve becomes Halloween. But there's also this continued emphasis on the dead and upon dead spirits. You know, the pagans were afraid of the dead spirits coming in and harming them or tricking them or whatever. And the medieval Catholic perspective, they were praying for souls in purgatory. Very different thing. But there is this emphasis on the dead. But there's also a secular influence. It is my opinion that Halloween as we know it today is not a pagan holiday. Halloween, the way we understand it, the way we celebrate it in our culture, it's not pagan. The way that we understand and celebrate Halloween in our culture, definitely not Christian. The way that we understand and celebrate Halloween in our culture is a secular holiday. It is a secular holiday. And secular simply means not religious. There is a distinction between the religious and the secular. And this really exists between like the hierarchy of the church, priests and monks and all of those. And the secular refers to like the laity, regular people, people who aren't in the business of religion, if you will. Today, secular refers to like the non-believing world, the world that is completely distinct from religion entirely. So when I say it's a secular holiday, what I mean basically is it is an irreligious holiday. It's not associated with either paganism nor Christianity. It's just kind of a secular holiday. Very similar to how we celebrate Christmas oftentimes, to how Easter is celebrated, to Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving, you could say, is a secular holiday in a sense. And I think that Halloween is the same way because Halloween has significant secular influences. So far, the things that we've talked about, they resemble very faintly some things that we see. Like the whole Samhain thing, it resembles very faintly. You can see some of like the shadows of modern Halloween when we talk about that. But when we talk about the secular influence, we got to start with colonial America. Remember, we're talking about people from the British Isles. Well, they came to the New World. They came to America. And many of those who came to America were Puritans. Many of those who came to America were Reformed Christians who were coming to the New World to set up shop and do their own thing. And especially among the Puritans in Massachusetts, they did not have anything to do with All Hallows Eve. They had nothing to do with All Saints' Day, All Souls' Day. In fact, Massachusetts, as a colony, banned the celebration of Halloween, banned the celebration of Christmas, banned the celebration of these different holidays that had cropped up. Why? Because they were Catholic. And they didn't want anything to do with the Catholics. The Puritan reformers wanted to separate themselves from the Catholic Church. In fact, and I'm getting a little off track here, but the Puritans in England were also known as separatists. And they were called Puritans because they were trying to purify the Anglican Church, the Church of England, from all of the Catholic influence. They were trying to purify the Anglican Church. That's why they were called Anglicans. Okay? So in there was a big battle there for a long time in England. The Puritans came to America. They said, we're not going to celebrate any of these Catholic holidays. They're all banned. They're all outlawed. But what they did do in colonial America was celebrate these harvest festivals. And that's kind of where we get Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving is an example of one of these early harvest festivals that was celebrated by the colonizers in the New World. And Halloween at this same time was also part of a harvest festival. You know, at this time of year there is harvesting. And think about it. What do we think about when we think of Halloween in terms of like produce? What do you?
Pumpkins.
Pumpkins. Are there any pumpkins in Europe?
I would be if I was there.
No, pumpkins were in the New World. There were no pumpkins in Europe before the 1600s, right? Before the 1500s. There was no pumpkins in Europe. What's another thing of, you think of corn mazes? Guess what? There's no corn in Europe either. So two of the main articles of produce that we think about when we think about Halloween, corn, candy corn, right? Pumpkins, you carve the pumpkins. These are New World phenomena. These things didn't exist. The Celts didn't have pumpkins. The Celts weren't carving pumpkins at Samhain, okay? The Celts weren't setting up corn mazes for their kids to run through when they were worshiping pagan deities and doing all the things they're doing. The medieval European Catholic Church wasn't doing any of that stuff either. Pumpkins and corn and all that stuff is distinctly New World. And it comes into play because in the New World, these things were part of harvest festivals. At this time of year, you're harvesting all that kind of stuff. And they would celebrate and they would party and they would feast. Very similar, once again, to what we see with the Celtic people. And it's not only the Celtic people, it's all peoples everywhere. You study any culture, any society, there's all kinds of different holidays, feast times, all of these things, especially in the fall during harvest time. This is like a fundamentally human thing to celebrate and have holidays during the harvest time.
Are they doing it now?
Is whom doing it?
Like you said that they didn't have pumpkins or corn, but now that things go flip, do they do it now?
Well, that's a very interesting thing. And I'm going to come back to that question. Can I come back to that question? Because remember, I can't emphasize this enough. Don't forget where all of this started. This is amongst a very specific peoples, the Celtic peoples in the British Isles. And then they come to America. And so now we're talking about what is happening in America with the influence of these British peoples, these Celtic peoples. So I'll come back to your question in just a moment. For a long time in American history, Halloween was not a big deal. Nobody cared about it. Just like, in some local places, there was some emphasis on it, but for the most part, it's like a national holiday. Nobody cared about Halloween. And we found that to be true about Christmas. We found that to be true about Thanksgiving. We have found that to be true about many of the holidays that we have studied so far. For much of American history, there was local things, there was local celebrations, but it wasn't like nationwide national holiday until in the 1800s, we started to have an immigration influx. And it wasn't from the southern border, it was from Europe. And in the 1800s, we got a huge influx of Irish and Scottish immigrants. And these Irish and Scottish immigrants who came into America brought with them their culture, brought with them their traditions, brought with them their practices. And so during the 1800s, when we had this influx of Irish immigrants, we began to see some of these more old world Celtic Samhain festival practices coming back into America and becoming popular in some of the major urban centers. Things such as, this is really like the origin of trick-or-treating, where it was a common practice, even in times past in medieval Europe, they called it souling, which is around a holiday, these kids would go out and they would go from house to house and they would sing songs and ask for bread and ask for cakes and sweets and ask for beer and all kinds of things. And, on these holidays, the people in the houses would give the stuff out to the kids. This happened around Christmas time. This happened around All Saints Day. All these major holidays, it was common for kids to go out and to go door to door asking for cakes and goodies and stuff. And people would give them out. And they called this practice souling. And this would happen on October 31st. As time would go on, in the 1800s in America, after all these Irish immigrants came in, there began to be this practice, and the name is escaping me, but it was basically like a night of mischief. It was where all these kids would go around and pull pranks. All these kids would go around and do silly little things, Most of it was harmless, but it became such a problem, egging people's houses and doing real vandalism. There for a while in the early 1900s, late 1800s, you were having towns and places like, we've got to outlaw this. We can't allow this to keep happening because there was this mischief going on. And that was part of the Irish culture coming in. And some of these other practices were there. So for most of American history, Halloween wasn't a big deal. It was more like a fall festival type of a thing. When the immigrants came in the 1800s, the Irish, they brought with them a lot of their old world customs, their old world traditions that carry over from Samhain, that carry over from the Catholic influence there. And then there's another thing that plays in to how we understand Halloween, and that is Gothic literature. You know what I'm talking about when I talk about Gothic literature? I'm talking about Victorian horror literature. We're talking about things like Frankenstein's monster. We're talking about things like Count Dracula and various and sundry different kind of horror literature that existed in the 1800s up to the early 1900s. The two most popular ones, of course, are Frankenstein and Dracula. Okay? This was a brand new genre of literature in the 1800s. It never really existed before this, and you can look it up. I'm not an English teacher. I don't know all the details about this, but this kind of, when we think of Halloween, one of the things we think of is like horror movies. When we think of Halloween, one of the things we think of is monsters and ghouls and ghosts and all of this stuff. And in no small part, this is influenced by Gothic literature. As I said earlier, particularly Frankenstein and Dracula. But it's not only that, it's that combined with Hollywood. So now we're in the 1900s and we see movies being made about Frankenstein, movies being made about werewolves, movies being made about Dracula, movies being made about all of these horror monsters. And if you fast forward to today, yeah, you've got zombies, that's part of it. But you fast forward, you've got movies like Saw and Halloween and Friday the 13th and Freddy and like all of these crazy horror movies that exist. Every single year, this year on Halloween, there's going to be some new, cheesy, disgusting horror movie that comes out. And it's just associated with that time of year. The blood and the violence and the horror and the gore. That is all associated with Halloween, but that is the product not of paganism. That is the product not of Christian influence. That is the product of Gothic literature and Hollywood. That's why I'm saying there is a huge secular influence on Halloween as well. And the other big thing that kind of shaped Halloween as we know it is post-World War II prosperity. Post-war prosperity in the United States of America. The culture in the 1950s and the rise of the middle class and a bunch of expendable wealth in America really paved the way for Halloween as we know it today. So all of those things, colonial America, Irish immigration, Gothic literature, Hollywood, and post-war prosperity, how has that influenced what we know as Halloween? Well, we have this emphasis on fall festivity. Think of pumpkins, think of corn, think of adolescent mischief, trick or treat, right? Give me a treat or I'm going to play a trick. That's that old Irish thing. The horror genre, violence and gore, and then modern trick-or-treating with candy and costumes. All of that is the result of these secular influences that have created Halloween as we know it. I want to pause for just a second and see any questions, any comments, any thoughts about anything we've talked about.
Well, the corn came from the Indians. Did the pumpkins and the watermelons come from the Indians?
Well, I mean, I don't know. The Indians, of course, knew how to like harvest that stuff because they lived here, and I'm sure that they showed the settlers how to do some of that to some degree. But I mean, the settlers weren't stupid either; they figured some of that out themselves, I'm sure. So, but to kind of cut to the heart of that, it is true, like we said, that those different pieces of produce were like New World things. They didn't exist in Europe.
Well, they might have got it from Mexico too. I think Mexico.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, which is part of the New World, right? And so, yeah, a lot of that stuff that we think about really, the reason why I even bring that up is because, as I said before, it's some of us have the idea that like these old Celts back in the times of Julius Caesar were like carving pumpkins to ward off evil spirits or something. And if you carve a pumpkin today, that means you're worshiping the devil. But that's just not true. That's just not true. The whole thing of carving pumpkins didn't even really become a thing until like the late 1800s and the early 1900s, again with the influence of the Irish, all those immigrants that came in. And the elevation of the pumpkin, I mean, it is like a distinctly American thing. Because there's no pumpkins in Japan, as far as I know, not naturally. There's no pumpkins anywhere where people have begun to celebrate Halloween. And another thing that I want to point out in this is that Halloween really is like an English phenomenon. Halloween never existed anywhere in the world except for in the British Isles and in America. This is the only place. Nobody else celebrates Halloween. Now, you might think of Mexico and the Day of the Dead, but the Day of the Dead is not the same thing as Halloween. It's a very different thing. And I don't have anything to here to talk about the Day of the Dead, but it's a similar deal going on. But it's not the same thing as Halloween. Now, what began to happen, as of 2021 in the United States of America, there was over $10 billion spent on Halloween. Halloween is the second highest grossing holiday in America in terms of how much people spend. And it's only behind Christmas. So it goes Christmas and then Halloween. Billions and billions of dollars every year are spent on Halloween. And so this is a uniquely American thing, but because it is such a financial boom, what we are seeing now is other places in the world beginning to celebrate Halloween. Because we have seen Halloween kind of adopted into American pop culture, and American pop culture is exported all over the world, it's not uncommon to see Halloween celebrations in Japan. It's not uncommon to see Halloween celebrations in other places in Europe and South America. There are people all over the world now who celebrate Halloween, and that wasn't the case even 30 or 40 years ago. So this celebration of Halloween is being exported in no small part due because of the money that is involved with it. And it has nothing to do with pagan Celts. It has nothing to do with All Saints' Day or All Souls' Day. This is a purely secular materialism, looking for materialistic holiday. It's just an opportunity for people to make a lot of money, for people to spend a lot of money, and for people to do some things. So
That felt like it's also an important time for people to socialize.
yeah,
That's, if it wasn't fun and people didn't socialize, they would have lost this way burnt out years ago.
yeah.
The kids look forward to it because it's fun to get candy and be with their friends and express their.
It's got some dangers now that you don't know the people. There's no good candy.
Yeah.
Most people go to certain areas called the rich sections.
But that's part of it, right? There is a cultural bonding thing, and that's part of the fall festival. That's part of even Samhain, where all the different groups would get together and they would intermarry and they would conduct business and stuff. Part of it is that cultural, societal celebration. It is a cultural tradition. It is a cultural holiday. It's a cultural celebration that does bring people together, and it builds cohesion, if you will. It is one of those things that is used that way.
Can I ask you, do you know if the Mexican Day of the Dead is a religious?
It's definitely got religious overtones. I don't know much about the Day of the Dead, and I don't want to get caught flat-footed speaking about something I don't know about.
I thought, well, maybe a little bit.
Well, it's definitely a spiritual aspect to it, right? Because as far as I know, they're communicating with dead relatives
That's
and
one of
stuff.
those Catholics marry up with it, but it's socializing with your past dead, going to the graveyard, presenting them presents. So you're doing something God said don't do.
Yeah. But even there's that similarity, there's this fascination with the world of the living and the dead, and how at this time of year they're kind of brought close together. And we saw that even when we were talking about Samhain and the Celts and stuff. So there is, even cross-culturally, this fascination with the dead and the spiritual world that is kind of happening all at this time in the year. I want to talk about, for a few moments, Christians and Halloween. Because the question always comes up, well, should we celebrate Halloween? Should we not celebrate Halloween? Etc., etc. And I think it's important, if we're going to have that conversation, to understand that Halloween is celebrated in very different ways. There are all kinds of different ways that people celebrate Halloween. One way that people celebrate Halloween is their kids get together and they dress up in costumes and they go trick-or-treating, and you might carve pumpkins or go to a fall festival. And it's just a time of year which developed in like the 1950s, where middle-class parents who have extra money to spend the money on costumes and candy and fall festivals, and they go out and they just have fun and they have a good time, and that's it. And for many people, that is the whole of Halloween. That's all that it is. There are, for some people, Halloween is a very different thing. There are some people who are involved in the occult. There are some people who are involved with neo-paganism, which just means new paganism, who are involved with new pagan practices. There is a pagan revival happening in our society. There is a revival of witchcraft and the occult happening in our society. And if you're involved in that world, Halloween might look very different for you. Halloween is going to be a night of witchcraft and sacrifices and seances and all of that kind of a thing, which is obviously evil, right? That's behavior that is obviously banned in Scripture. We are not to participate in that kind of thing in any way. If we're participating in witchcraft or that kind of stuff, that's very bad. We don't want anything to do with that. Most people are not associated with that in any way, shape, or form. I don't know a single person in real life who is involved with that kind of thing. I know they're out there. There are people whom I know of that may be involved in some of that stuff, but all in all, that is the experience of very few people. But I want to say this. There are people who come out of that world, who become Christians, and they look at Christianity and they look at Christian parents who, allow their kids to do the kind of normal, secular American Halloween thing, and they feel very strongly that this is inappropriate. And they would say, how can you allow your child, how can you participate in this day that is so clearly evil? It is like the highest holy day among the witches. How could you participate in this kind of thing? And some people have that very real concern because they come from that world. And so when they think about Halloween, that is what they think about. Just like the people who have the traditional secular American experience of Halloween, that's what they think about when they think about Halloween. And they say, well, that's harmless. Nobody's worshiping the devil over here. There's nothing crazy going on over here, because that's their experience. Well, these witches and occult and neo-pagans, when they're converted, they have a very specific experience that shapes the way that they view this. There is also another aspect of Halloween in the way it's celebrated, and that is with debauchery and partying. Debauchery is like drunken orgies, sexual immorality, drunkenness, drug use, and just partying in general. There is like the immoral, there's like the slutty outfit trope that goes into Halloween, all of that kind of debauchery that's associated with Halloween. And obviously as Christians, we're not to participate in any of that either. It's sinful to participate in that kind of stuff. It's sinful. Like if you are a Christian woman and you're like, oh, it's Halloween, I can't wait to dress up like a slutty cheerleader and go get drunk and high at this party and fornicate and stuff, that's a problem, right? That's not good. If you're going to celebrate Halloween, that's not the correct way to celebrate it. That is sinful. That is inappropriate. That we can't do that. But that is a part of the Halloween culture. And once again, you might have people who come out of that culture. They come into Christianity, and they're going to view Halloween through the lens of their own experience. And they're going to say, I can't participate in this, my family's not going to participate in this, and you shouldn't participate in this because this is what Halloween's about. Halloween is about orgies and drunkenness and drug use. Just like Halloween is about witchcraft and seances and devil worship. Just like these people say Halloween is about candy and costumes. These different experiences shape the way that we view it. And finally, the other major thing about Halloween that we think about is the celebration of gore and violence. We talked about that with all the movies and like all the thriller movies and stab 'em and kill 'em movies and stuff. And all of that stuff, that's really strongly associated with Halloween too. My opinion on those kind of things is simply that they're bad for your soul. My opinion is that violence, unnecessary violence, gore, that kind of a thing, I just think it's bad for your soul. I think if we're consuming that kind of media, it's just bad for you. It's like eating handfuls of sugar is bad for you. If you're putting that into your body, it's going to have an effect. If you're putting those kind of graphic, violent images into your soul, it's going to have a negative effect on you. I'm not comfortable saying that it's sinful. I definitely don't think it's pleasing to God to see creatures made in His image cut up and killed and murdered, which is a violation of His law. Definitely not pleasing to God. I'm not willing to say it's sinful, but I do think that it is just bad for your soul to consume that kind of media. I think it's bad for you. Go ahead.
A lot of it is actually showing pleasure in torture.
Yeah.
And that's you can say there's an army and people will say, that's just true to life. People need to see this. But you see Saul and stuff like that. People would flock. Didn't used to be like that. We used to watch scary movies, like you said, the old Frankensteins and stuff like that. It wasn't about the gore. It was about being scared because of these possible dark forces.
Yeah.
But now it's beyond that. It's about mutilation of the body and how you deal with that. And it desensitizes people's all the way to their spirit.
Yeah.
If you allow that to come in, I understand what you're saying. It's beyond just dark.
Yeah, I agree. I just think it's bad for your soul. I think it's bad for your soul to expose yourself to frightful things too. Paul told Timothy, we are not given a spirit of fear, but of love and of power and of a sound mind. And if we're intentionally scaring ourselves, submitting ourselves to a spirit of fear, I don't think that's good for your soul either. I don't think that kind of stuff is good for you. That's an aspect of Halloween that I think is bad for you. To kind of recap, Halloween is celebrated in these different ways, and depending on your experience is really going to color how you approach the topic of Halloween. It really is. And so I can understand the witch who comes to Christ and is adamant that Halloween is evil and nobody should participate in it because of all this evil stuff that happens. I can understand and respect that point of view because for them, that was their whole experience with it. I understand that. But at the same time, I can understand the parent who says, it's really just like an American traditional holiday that doesn't have anything to do with anything. It's just an opportunity to play some games and to get some candy or whatever. I can understand that perspective too. And for most people, that is the whole thing. That's the experience. Like I said, my opinion is that Halloween is simply an American secular holiday. It's an American festival. It's a cultural festival. It's a cultural holiday. It's not religious. It's just cultural.
I think one of the problems is when you go back to Paul, when he's talking about meat sacrificed to idols.
Yeah.
It's not a sin if you ask for blessings from God. But if it offends my brother, that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, that's perfect. So let's go to Romans 14. You bring that up. That's perfect. We've got some time. Let's go to Romans 14. And let's try to read the whole chapter if we can, and then we'll kind of talk about it. Because at this point, we've kind of broken down the history. I know that was a ton of information coming at you super fast. I hope you were able to catch some of it. But we've talked about the history, the pagan influence, the Christian influence, the secular influence. We've talked about the different ways that Halloween is celebrated, that Halloween is experienced. And now, let's talk about coexisting as believers in the church. How should we think about it? Because this is a controversial issue. Like I said, when you've got people who are coming out of these different areas and telling other believers, you must not do this, and then you have other people who are saying it's not a big deal, there is conflict here around all of the holidays, but particularly Halloween, because it's got the history it's got. It's got the emphasis it's got. It's got all of these things that are associated with it that are very clearly not pleasing to God. Very clearly. Witchcraft and that kind of pagan worship, that's not pleasing to God. Debauchery is not pleasing to God. Violence and gore, that's not pleasing to God. And that's kind of a big part of what Halloween is. But it's not that way for everybody. So let's look at Romans 14. And let's go ahead and read verses 1 through 4 to begin.
Except the one whose faith is weak, without quarreling over disputable matters, One person's faith allows them to eat anything, but another whose faith is weak eats only vegetables. The one who eats everything must not treat with contempt the one who does not, and the one who does not eat everything must not judge the one who does, for God has accepted them. Who are you to judge someone else's servant? To their own master, servants stand or fall, and they will stand, for the Lord is able to make them stand.
Okay, so you might be reading this and think, eating meat versus herbs, what in the world does this have to do with Halloween? Well, the thing is in the early church, there was a great controversy because most of the meat that you could buy at that time had been sacrificed to pagan gods. Almost all of the meat in the market was sacrificed at one temple or another. And everybody knew that. And so you had some Christians who existed in these Greek cities who would say, well, I can't eat this meat in good conscience because this meat was sacrificed to Zeus. This meat was sacrificed to Diana. This meat was sacrificed to whoever. And they said, I cannot eat that because it was sacrificed to this demonic false god and pagan rituals. I can't eat this meat. And then you had others, like the Apostle Paul, who said, it really doesn't matter because those false gods aren't even real. It doesn't make a difference if you eat the meat or not. There's nothing wrong with the meat, but look at what he says in these verses. He says, do not despise the one who does not eat. So he's telling these Christians who say, my conscience allows me to eat whatever I want to. I don't care that it was sacrificed to an idol. I'm not worshiping the idol. I'm eating the meat. I'm not worshiping the idol. And Paul says, that's fine. People who don't eat, don't judge them who do eat. But also he says to the people who do eat, don't judge those who don't eat. Because your conscience tells you it's okay to eat that meat. Theirs tells them it's not. And that's what he goes on in verse 4. Who are you to judge another man's servant? Namely, God's servant, right? We don't judge one another in terms of what we eat. Each one of us will be judged by God. Each one of us has to give an account for the way we live our lives before God. You don't owe me an account of what you eat. You don't owe me an account of the days that you celebrate or don't celebrate. You're going to give that account to God, and we're going to continue this through. Let's read verses now 5 and 6.
One person esteems one day above another, another esteems every day alike. Let each be fully convinced in his own mind. He who observes the day observes it to the Lord, and he who does not observe the day to the Lord, he does not observe it. He who eats to the Lord, and he gives God thanks, and he will do. And he who does not eat to the Lord, he does not eat and give Lord thanks.
Okay, so here, and now he's talking about holy days. And of course, this would be like observation of the Sabbath, observation of new moon festivals, observation of various Jewish holidays over and against not celebrating these holidays. He's speaking, one person regards this day as unto the Lord, and another doesn't. One person treats all days as the same. And what he's saying here is it doesn't really matter. If you observe one day as special unto the Lord, then you are observing it unto the Lord. If you observe every day as being the same, then you're doing that to the Lord. So whether or not you're esteeming one day or above another, either way, if you're doing it convinced in your mind of that you're doing it for the Lord, that's what really matters. He that regards the day regards it to the Lord. He that does not regard the day does not regard it unto the Lord. The one who eats, eats unto the Lord and gives God thanks. The one who does not eat the meat sacrificed to idols, it is as unto the Lord he does not eat, and he gives God thanks. And so let's continue on here. Verse 7 and 8.
For we don't live for ourselves or die for ourselves. If we live, it's to honor the Lord. If we die, it's to honor the Lord. So we live or die, we belong to the Lord.
That's good to stop. We can summarize these first 8 verses as this. Whatever you do, do it as unto the Lord. If you eat, eat as unto the Lord. If you celebrate this particular day, do it as unto the Lord. For we don't live unto ourselves. We don't die unto ourselves. Whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's. We belong to the Lord. Everything we do is for the Lord. Okay? Let's continue on. Let's read verse 9, 10, and 11.
Christ died and rose again for this very purpose, to be the Lord both of the living and of the dead. So why do you condemn another believer? Why do you look down on another believer? Remember, we will all stand before the judgment seat of God. For the scriptures say, as surely as I live, says the Lord, every knee will bend to me, and every tongue will declare allegiance to God.
Okay, so God is the God of the living and the dead. And again, Paul is emphasizing we don't judge one another in the church. We don't judge one another based on these matters of conscience. I cannot condemn somebody because their conscience allows them to come to a different conclusion than mine does concerning what kind of food I'm going to eat, concerning what kind of holidays I'm going to celebrate or not celebrate. If we're living as unto the Lord, it's not our job, it's not our responsibility to pass judgment on one another over these issues of conscience that the Lord is talking about here. Any questions or comments about what we've read so far? Let's continue to read. I really want to finish this chapter. I think it's important that we read the whole thing. So let's read verse 12 and 13.
So then each of us shall give account of himself to God. Therefore, let us not judge one another anymore, but rather resolve this, not to put a stumbling block or a cause to fall in our brother's way.
Okay, here's where the conversation begins to shift a little bit. So far, Paul has been emphasizing this idea of the freedom of the conscience. Brother Chuck, he eats pork because he likes bacon. Gretchen doesn't eat pork because she thinks that the dietary restrictions in the law are applicable to her. And so they've got like this conflict where Gretchen's like, oh, you filthy Gentile, why do you do this? And he's like, oh, you religious Pharisee, why do you care about these things? And they've got this problem brewing. And what Paul is saying is both of y'all need to knock it off. If she doesn't eat the pork, it's because she's doing it as unto the Lord. He does eat the pork with Thanksgiving, so mind your own business. That's basically what Paul is saying at this point. We have the freedom of conscience to handle these things. But now he's about to shift. Notice what he said in verse 13. Let us not judge one another anymore, but judge this, that no man puts a stumbling block or an occasion for offense or an occasion to fall in his brother's way. And here he's about to shift the conversation. What he's saying now is, you are free to eat or to not eat or to celebrate or to not celebrate, but we need to pay attention to something very specific. And I'm going to let him fill that out more than I fill that out. Let's read verse 14, 15, and 16.
I know and am convinced in the Lord Jesus that nothing is unclean in itself. But to him who thinks anything to be unclean, to him it is unclean. For if because of food your brother is hurt, you are no longer walking according to love. Do not destroy with your food him who Christ died for. Therefore, do not let what is for you a good thing, be spoken of as evil.
Okay, so here he really lays it out. He says nothing is unclean of itself. He's speaking about foods, of course, in this context. He's saying just because it was sacrificed to an idol, just because it's a pig, that doesn't make it unclean. If we enjoy it with Thanksgiving, God's given it to us to enjoy that way. We're taking this principle and we're applying it to Halloween. But look at what he says. He says, if your brother is grieved with your eating, you are not walking in love. So if Brother Chuck invites Gretchen over to the house and tries to feed her ham, he's not operating in love. He's free to eat the ham. He can eat the ham. Nothing's unclean in of itself. But we know that our brother or our sister has an issue with this conscience. Paul is more concerned that we do not cause our brother or sister to stumble. He's more concerned that we limit our freedom for the sake of another person than that we enjoy our freedoms for our own sake. He says it's not an act of love if we cause a stumbling stone to appear before somebody else. And this is a case where our good, what is good for us, can be spoken of as being evil. Do not let your good be evil spoken of. For you, it's good. Your conscience is clear. Your conscience allows you to do this thing, to eat this meat, to celebrate this day. But there are others who it doesn't. If we talk about our witch friend, for instance, and I won't assign anybody the role of being a witch in here just because. But let's say we have a witch friend who came out of that world, who is now a Christian and who is very adamant that Halloween is evil and we shouldn't participate in it. If I had this friend who was from that world and I believed that it was fine, like the costumes and the candy and all that's not a big deal, you know what I wouldn't do? I wouldn't flaunt my freedom in that person's face. I wouldn't want to cause that person to stumble. I wouldn't argue with that person about their position. Their experience has told them that this is the case. But me, if I have the freedom to do this thing that they don't have the freedom to do, I'm not going to do it in front of them. You could talk about alcohol and tobacco use. This falls under the same thing. It's under the same rubric, Some people say, well, to smoke tobacco is not that big of a deal. Other people say it's a gross sin and you'll go to hell forever. And if I have someone who says it's a gross sin and you'll go to hell forever, I'm not going to smoke a cigar in front of them. I'm not going to offer them a cigar. I'm not going to do that kind of thing. If I believe it's okay to smoke a cigar, I'm not going to flaunt that freedom to somebody who thinks that it's not good. Same thing with alcohol. If I believe it's okay to have a drink of wine with dinner, I'm not going to flaunt that freedom to an alcoholic. I'm not going to flaunt that freedom to someone who thinks that drinking alcohol under any occasion is always a sin. Why? Because we don't want to put a stumbling block in front of our brother.
I look at it this way. Their faith is weak. If any of that stuff could possibly shape their faith, then they put these things in their faith as detectors, and if you stumble across those or the stumbling block, it could cause them to actually shake their faith, maybe lose or walk away from the faith.
That's why invite them to a Halloween costume party.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're not going to invite our witch friend to the Halloween costume party.
But we actually have liberty in God. We have that freedom. That's why God goes on to say, basically, you're saved from past, present, and future sin, as long as you walk with God. And so we have that liberty, and some of these people have put themselves with restraints. I'll let you finish because we only got a couple minutes.
Well, that's so true. And I'm going to read just a couple more verses here to try to get through this. He says, the kingdom of God is not meat and drink, but righteousness and peace and joy in the Holy Ghost. For he that in these things serves Christ is acceptable to God and approved of men. So the kingdom of God, if we're majoring on all these minors, he's saying, we're missing the point. That's not what the kingdom of God is about. The kingdom of God is about righteousness and peace and joy in the Holy Ghost. And the one who serves after Christ in righteousness and peace and joy in the Holy Ghost is a servant of Christ. It's not all of these other things that we think about. He goes on and says, let us therefore follow after the things which make for peace, and wherewith we may edify one another or build one another up. Meat, he says, does not destroy the work of God. All things are pure, but it is evil for the man who eats with offense. If you cannot participate in Halloween with a clear conscience, it is evil for you to participate in Halloween. If you cannot eat the pork with a clear conscience, you should not eat the pork. It is a sin for you. Look at what he goes on and says. It is good neither to eat flesh, nor to drink wine, nor anything whereby your brother will stumble, or is offended, or is made weak. So if I have a brother or a sister who is weak in the faith and for whom this might cause to stumble, it is good for me to abstain from my own freedom. If I have a brother or a sister who treats Halloween with a serious issue in conscience, it is good for me not to celebrate in order to not cause that person to stumble. Does that make sense? I'll tell you in a different context, in the Christmas context. I don't want or like Christmas trees put up in the church. I don't want Christmas lights put up around the church. I don't want Christmas trees in the church. And you say, why not? We love Christmas trees. You have a Christmas tree in your home. Yes, I do. But what's the reason why? Because there are people whose conscience does not allow them to have a Christmas tree, to celebrate Christmas in that way. And at the church, which is a place for all of the people of God to come and to worship, I'm not going to throw a stumbling block out for somebody by having a decorated Christmas tree in the sanctuary. Does that make sense? That's an example of where I'm trying to honor this principle and say, I don't want to cause somebody to stumble. As a church, we're not going to have a Halloween Christmas or a Halloween party where people dress up and do all this. Like, we're just not going to do that. Because there are people who are Christians who cannot celebrate Halloween in good conscience. And I'm not willing to put a stumbling block in front of them. I don't want to do that. Does that make sense? Verse 22, he says, do you have faith? Have it to yourself before God. Happy is he that does not condemn himself in anything that he allows. But the one that doubts is damned if he eats, because he does not eat in faith. For whatever is not of faith is sin.
I think that last one's so good.
Yep. Whatever is not of faith is sin. So that's it. That's the history of Halloween. That's kind of where some of these traditions come from. I hope that some of what we talked about can help us to navigate the issue. Is there any questions, comments, feedback about this? Go ahead.
Yeah. When we're talking about dressing up as a princess and eating candy, that's one thing. But you have to remember that demons are real, and there's some things they are attracted to. So Halloween doesn't happen just in your house. Where are your kids going?
Yeah.
Tarot cards, Ouija boards, seances, and these things are dangerous. They are invitations to demons. Where are your kids going? I think it's real important. Witches are real. I don't know how much power they have, but they do have power. And I guess it brings it home a little bit more to me because when I taught in Tulsa, there's a few things that happened that Halloween lost its fun and games. I taught biology. 2 different students came to me and wanted to know about the dangers and the diseases in drinking fresh cow blood. My roommate was also a teacher. One of her students had gotten involved with a witch's coven thinking it was all fun and games, and then realized they were deadly serious and she wanted out. And my roommate was counseling her and trying to help her to get saved and get out of this stuff, and my roommate got a death threat. So when we see through that lens, I'm very leery of Halloween.
I know an expert on all these things. He wasn't until all of you called. Pastor Billy Crone, I don't know if you ever heard of him, Sunrise Church out of Las Vegas. He's written so many books, and I've watched so many shows on him, and he makes it so simple. He has all kinds of explanations. Shows you about all these things, even coming into the church, angel cards, you know, tarot.
Well, I am not gonna tell anybody, don't take a kid trick or treating. Hey, it can be a lot of fun and games. Just realize there is real evil out there.
yeah.
I think you can't dismiss that. And I think you need to know, because you may think your 10-year-old, oh, what could they do at a Halloween party? Hey, you don't know if they don't pull out a deck of tarot cards. And I would be very leery. I would want to know where my child is going.
And this is the thing. So this is the thing. And this is what it comes down to with any of these holidays, whether it's Easter or Christmas or whatever. It's the question is, what are you doing? What are you doing? Are you participating in paganism? Because if you are, then that's what you're doing. But if you're not, then you're not doing that. When it comes to Halloween, are you participating in witchcraft? Because if you are, that's what you're doing, and that is evil. But if you're not doing that. And so you know, just like our sister is saying, she's being very careful to say this is not what everyone, but because she understands that if you're not doing this, then you're not doing it. But those things are real. That element of it does exist. You know, witches are just as real as this table or this chair in this room. Like, don't forget the spiritual world is real. All of this stuff does exist. But what are you doing? Because if you're doing that, then you're doing something wrong. But if you're not doing that, then you're not doing that. Does that make sense? That's very good to point out, yeah.
Be worried about your kids, because you
Yeah.
may be against it, and you may tell you may protect your kids, especially when they're 10. You're not going to want to sit down and talk to them about demons. But if they're going to leave your presence and go to somebody else's party, I would just want to know what's going on.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Go ahead.
You didn't answer my question.
About the other places? Yeah, we did. We talked about it. So Halloween has been exported all over the world now. It's happening in Japan, it's happening in Europe, it's happening in South America, and mostly as a commercial phenomenon because of the money that's involved in it.
What it was, the Isles or whatever?
Yeah, the British Isles.
So they do now the food.
Yeah, they always did it, right? That's where it originated.
Well, I mean, with the pumpkins, corn, I'm saying.
Yeah. Yeah, you can look up pictures of people in Japan celebrating Halloween, and they've got the scream mask and the carved pumpkins and everything. But all of that is an American phenomenon that has been exported by Hollywood, right? So, maybe I wasn't clear. The modern American celebration of Halloween has been exported all over the world now. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry.
Follow the money.
Follow the money. Very good. Well, I've kept you a little late. I hope that this was helpful. I hope you all enjoyed it. I know it was a lot of me talking. That's kind of how these usually turn out. But I hope it also helped to inform us and help us think maybe a little differently than we may have thought coming in about the issue of Halloween. So, if there's no other questions or comments, Brother Chuck, will you close us in prayer this evening?